Hello everybody. Once again, this is Fred Wankwa coming to you from our studios in Chicago with another edition of Bold Talk on LNTV. And as usual, I'd like to say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to you, depending on where you are around the world. This edition is talking about Biafra, Nigeria, Gowon, and Betrayal. Our facts are ours. We're human. We made mistakes. It's time to forgive. That's all fine and dandy. But how do you forgive something people refuse to accept that they made mistakes and that they hurt their fellow Nigerians? The mission here is not to say who is right or wrong. 50 plus years later, that's irrelevant. Rather, it's to bring the truth about our history to bear. You're gonna hear me a lot talking about atrocities committed against Igbos. Those atrocities were committed against Igbos also by fellow Igbos who are Fulani Cabal-pocketed. Why do I keep going back to this, you may ask? Because I hurt for Nigeria. I even hurt more as an Igbo man, not because of what the obvious enemies of Igbos want to do to Igbos, but the fact that some Igbos collaborate because they are paid off to do these things. And that's why I want to play you this song. It touches my heart, but it tells my story if you watch along with the things that scroll along below the video.
Yahweh na komitunaka o Osomwindo utande wapio Osomwindo utande wapio Koko na biso ya kala yena niye Yesu mwana nzambe yende mondele Adamu na Eva bangonde mindele Santo nyoso bangonde mindele bona nini yo na mitunaka Nzambe na komitunaka Yahweh na komitunaka Babukwa Nzambe tomonaka boye Santo nyoso foto se mindele Banjelu nyoso bango se mindele Sokiza bulu foto moto moindo Injustice utande wapio na mama Banoko bakanga biso maele boye Bike kwa bakoko bango baboyaka Kisya bakoko bango bandimaka te Kasi nanda kwa Nzambe biso tomonaka Tokosambela chapele na maboko tokosambela bikeko bitondi ndako kasi bikeko yango semindele pona nini nzambe
Folks, news distortion is going to be a big part of this episode. And coming from an Igbo person, the typical bigots who write it off, that's why I want to lead with Dele Faro Timid.
The same people who would have you believe that Igbos are your problem, their grandchildren are half Igbos. Some of them are married to Igbo people. Within their cabinet and inner circle, you'll find Igbo persons. They do not demand to know the ethnic affiliation of those with whom they associate. But you, who live and depend on your neighbors for your survival, are the ones helping to propagate the hatred. Have you asked yourself questions? Have you bothered to reflect? All of these you cannot see because you have simply received the hatred. So you forget nothing of the evils that you believe has been done to you. We're a nation of amnesiacs. We forget everything that is important.
Now to the Aburi discussions between Ojukwu and Yakubu Gowon. Pay good attention. Pay good attention, because if you pay attention to this documentary, it's a short one, you're really gonna see that it's all about propaganda. Aburi went very well. I'm not saying it was perfect. Any differences could easily have been handled with proper communication on both sides. I'm not trying to blame any side. But if you must blame a side, after you listen to this, you'll see that Ojukwu went back to Biafra, or to Eastern Nigeria at the time, with an agreement of what they reached in Aburi. Gowon went back to Nigeria, and after consultation, they decided to renege on the agreement. Listen carefully.
In the confusion that followed the second coup d'etat, the slender confidence that remained between the Igbo and the Northerners was shattered. Disturbances broke out in the east, but even more so in the north after August 1st, 1966. The mass killings of the Igbo in the north were a deplorable act that was condemned by Nigerians, including the military governors. With the counter-coup of July 29, 1966, the political development of Nigeria's federal structure took a different turn. It was accentuated even more by the fact that the Eastern Regional Government in Enugu immediately threatened secession if certain grievances and demands were not met. The immediate concern of the federal government, therefore, was for it to find ways to appease the East, so long as such concessions were within the framework of one Nigeria. Claiming he was not safe outside the East, the Eastern Military Governor, Lieutenant Colonel Chukwuemeka Odumegu Ojukwu, refused to leave the region for any meeting anywhere in Nigeria. In a rejoinder, the federal government too argued that the Nigerian leader, Yakubu Gowon, should also not go to the East for a meeting. His life, they also claimed, was not safe there either. Tension mounted, and Lieutenant General Joseph Arthur Ankra of Ghana offered a neutral meeting place. The venue was Aburi, Ghana. The Aburi meeting started on January 4th, 1967 and lasted for 2 days. Aburi was significant for several reasons. First, that the leaders met at all was an achievement in itself. But even more tangible was the fact that the leaders agreed that force would not be used to settle the brothers' palaver. There was also the question of the disposition of Nigerian troops and the reorganization of the army after the second coup on July 29, 1966, and the subsequent killing that followed in May and September. Further, Ojukwu said that his region was perturbed, that contrary to Gowon's promise on August 9, 1966, that all soldiers would return to their region of origin, northern troops still occupied the western region. Gowon replied that his promise of August 9 applied to the repatriation of soldiers of northern origin stationed in the east back to the north, and those of eastern origin stationed in the north back to the east. He had fulfilled his promise, he said. He then emphasized that soldiers of northern origin would remain in the west since there were only a few Yoruba in the Nigerian army. Ojukwu was not satisfied and further insisted on a reorganization of the army on a regional basis. Gowon was also firmly opposed to splitting up the army. Ojukwu claimed that Nigeria did not have a central government since the country, as a result of the second coup and its aftermath, resolved itself into 3 separate sovereign areas: the Lagos West-North area, the Midwest area, and the East area. But Gowon insisted that Nigeria was still one nation, an entity composed of 4 regions and a central government in Lagos. Ojukwu then proposed that the situation in the nation necessitated a drawing apart of the regions because the separation of forces, the separation of the population is, in all sincerity, necessary in order to avoid further friction and further killings. The other leaders, who all wanted one Nigeria, agreed to Ojukwu's proposal, but apparently without understanding the implication. This was the bombshell of Aburi. By agreeing to Ojukwu's argument that the region should first pull apart in order to stay together, the other leaders in effect sanctioned Biafra's secession, hence the end of Nigeria as a single nation. They attended and left the Aburi meeting with the firm belief that Nigeria should and would continue as one nation. But they had gone to that meeting, as it seems, without adequate preparations in terms of a crew of legal and political advisors which such a meeting demanded. They had gone to Aburi in a spirit of comradeship. Ojukwu, on the other hand, meant business. He arrived in Aburi with a strong team of legal, political, and economic advisors, secretaries, and realms of paper. Not only did the other leaders agree with Ojukwu that the regions and people of the nation should first draw apart, but they also agreed to the latter suggestion that there should be no more supreme commander of the army, hence no head of government or head of state. What Ojukwu wanted was that whoever was at the top should be a titular head who would only act when all of them have met and taken a unanimous decision. Since the unanimous decision of all the regions was required before he could act on all matters which affected any of the regions or the nations as a whole, the commander-in-chief and head of a government was only so in name. He would still be a titular head. The point of the agreement at Aburi was that each region would be responsible for its own affairs and that the federal military government would be responsible for matters that affected the entire country. A simple enough concept. Afterwards, the officers toasted their reconciliation and agreement with champagne. The federal delegation's jubilation was such that on his plane flight home, Ojukwu asked one of his secretaries whether the federal delegation had fully understood the implications of what had been agreed. However, no one at Aburi other than Ojukwu really understood the constitutional implications of what had been agreed. Ojukwu was obviously delighted with this, hence why he was in such a hurry to implement the decisions that were taken and why Gowon had to break his promise. Federal permanent secretaries who headed the various ministries of the government as of then, as well as political and legal experts in the country, were appalled at the content of the Aburi Agreement when their leaders returned home. The permanent secretaries met on January 20, 1967 to evaluate the agreement, and they rightly argued that the title of Commander-in-Chief was a subtle way of either abolishing the post of the Supreme Commander or declaring it vacant now that its previous occupant, Major General Aguiyi Ironsi, was dead. They further reported that the proposal that all appointments to top posts in the military, civil service, and the diplomatic corps be unanimously approved by the Supreme Military Council would tend to paralyze the functions of the Federal Public Service Commission. They also noted that the allegiance and loyalty of the regionally appointed officers of the federal government would be to regions, meaning in effect that there would be no federal public service. The summary of their report was that the Aburi Agreement summed up to a confederation. The leaders themselves were shocked. Then, from February 16 through February 18, 1967, Lieutenant Colonel Yakubu Gowon summoned a meeting of the secretaries to the military government and other officials which was held in Benin City over a memo one of the permanent secretaries had written concerning the Aburi Accord. The memo traced the long, hard road that Nigeria had traveled and stressed the need to keep a united nation. The permanent secretary who wrote this memo was Prince Solomon Akenzuwa, who later, as Erediawa I, became the 39th Oba of Benin on March 23, 1979. However, Prince Akenzuwa was an outstanding civil servant. In fact, he rose to become the Federal Permanent Secretary, Ministry of Health, before he retired in 1973. Akenzuwa in the memo said that Gowon had given too much away in Aburi and that it would lead to the destruction of the country. He also said that Gowon had legalized total regionalism, which would make the center very weak. Prince Akenzuwa further alluded in his memo that a weak center would lead to a confederation and a total disintegration of Nigeria. The shocking revelation of the meeting of the Aburi Agreement overshadowed some of the important decisions the leaders agreed to at Aburi in their search for peace and for a new basis of a stable federal union, or at least a national unity. Aburi on the whole was a big success, but the interpretation of what transpired at the meeting devalued the success. Ironically, implementing the decisions agreed on at Aburi was necessary. Ojukwu then set March 31, 1967 as a deadline for the unilateral implementation of the Aburi Accord. Gowon, on the other hand, broke his promise and restated that the constitutional changes the East proposed would not work because such changes would result in the end of Nigeria as a single nation. As Prince Akenzuwa had written in his memo, Gowon had given too much away in Aburi that would have led to the destruction of the country. He legalized total regionalism, which would make the center very weak. And a weak center would eventually lead to a confederation and total disintegration of Nigeria. While the Federal Permanent Secretaries were evaluating the documents to which their leaders were signatories, Ojukwu and the East had grown tougher with their demands. On their own, the other military leaders on March 17, 1967 issued a significant policy, Decree No. 8, which conferred far more powers on the regional governments than ever before. This was deliberately done in the hope that a new and greater decree of decentralization would placate the East so that it would not secede and a potentially subsequent brutal war would be avoided. This Decree No. 8 ignored the report of the permanent secretaries but did not fully concur with Ojukwu's demands. It also decentralized the government to such an extent that the regions were virtually autonomous units in which each of the regional governor had executive powers. However, Ojukwu would reject the decree because a part of the decree stated that no region shall exercise its executive authority so as to impede or prejudice the exercise of the executive authority of the Federation or to endanger the continuance of federal government in Nigeria. Further, it provided that the Supreme Military Council can also take appropriate measures against a region that attempts to secede from the rest of the Federation and could take over the functions of that region. In the meantime, the Yoruba people were dissatisfied with the presence of troops of northern origin who occupied the western region, and the decision to recruit Yoruba people into the army did little to ease those feelings. So, the Yoruba, through Chief Obafemi Awolowo, proposed that should Ojukwu and the East secede, the West would feel free to follow suit. The federal government was caught pants down while Ojukwu and his followers in the East popped champagne. While the federal government was still trying to steady itself from these revelations, the northern leaders made an astonishing suggestion: the creation of more states. The nation was stunned. The question of the creation of more states, particularly in the north, had been a perennial issue which northern politicians had always resisted. Thus, southerners had accused the north of trying to dominate Nigeria forever. They also believed that the Nigerian crisis would be over if the north accepts that power can be shared. Breaking up the north into more states, which was what the east and other parts of the nation wanted, would provide the answer. The northern decision was a pleasant surprise to most of the nation, particularly the minority people of the north, that is, the Middle Belt areas and those of the Cross River, Ogoja Rivers area, which Ojukwu would later claim as part of Biafra. Because of this, Ojukwu did not agree to the Northern Declaration for the creation of more states. The Yorubas, who had been one of the ardent advocates for the creation of more states, felt pleased with this unprecedented northern move, and they eventually threw their support behind the federal government. Now energized, the federal government was ready for a showdown with Ojukwu as the authorities in the eastern region executed some acts which provoked the federal government.
Now let's be real and let's face facts. Some of those acts that they executed that upset the federal government, two of them were the hijack of Nigerian planes that originated from, I think, Benin City. Nobody was killed, but the planes were hijacked. The other one was shutting down any revenue Nigeria could get from the oil fields, and something related to the railroads, shutting down any revenue that related to the railroads. Those things are no provoked the action to start the war. The war was started by Nigeria, not Biafra. The North, in desperation, made offers to the Southwest and made offers to the Delta, the Bibios, the Effiks, the Jaws, and all that. Desperate offers that were very enticing. Great. All those things were enticing in 1967. But as we are today, how buddy? All those benefits from 1967. Why are the people in the Delta calling for a Delta state and no longer want to be with Nigeria? Why are some in the Southwest calling for Dudua? The thing Igbos fought for in 1967 is still aching Nigeria today. To bring it to more recent times, in 2015 and 2019, Igbos were criticized for overwhelmingly voting against Buhari. They were criticized. They are difficult to deal with. They are bad people. Igbos are, how buddy? Who was right in 2015? I'm not throwing it in your face. I'm saying, how long does it take to take a step back and say enough of this bigotry?
disgracefully. They say Muritala was killed like a worthless piece of shit that he was.
Yes,